option that you have. So I would encourage people to also speak up and join the conversation. It's definitely my pleasure to be here this morning in conversation with Stacy and Damon when he arrives. And I was hoping, Stacy, that we could just get started with a deep introduction. And I think we can really take it there, talking about the journey of how that you found yourself on. So as you're telling us who you are and other sort of your like generic intro, like this is who I am, this is my role in this space. Can you also tell us maybe a little bit about the origin story of your own pain, of the trauma that you've experienced, the invisible wounds that Lee was talking about, and how you came to recognize that you've been living with trauma?
Yeah, let's dive right in. It's good to be among friends. I feel like it's good to be with folks in Alaska. I've had the opportunity to visit your gorgeous state twice. My parents actually once briefly owned a television station in Juneau, bought it, had 30 days, and then went back to Nebraska. And my mom was like, no, we're not moving to Juneau. And then my brother was born a few years later, I was born, and then she moved the family to Botswana. So I don't know what that says about her, but my dad loves Alaska. I've grown up with a lot of the stories about Alaska. And I think as any kid growing up in the lower 48, you'll learn a lot about Alaska and read a lot about Alaska. And obviously there's the magic and the reality, and maybe those two things don't always match up. And hopefully, though, you all have had multiple days where that has, by the various pictures that I can see that you've decided to use for Zoom. Some of you have definitely chosen those magical moments in Alaska. And then also good to see Maeve's name on here. We've had some conversations before, Maeve Nevins, about how we might be able to work together around getting people outdoors and helping overcome trauma and what that means from a military family perspective. So my journey really started when I came home from Iraq. I'm a 2000 graduate of the University of Mississippi. I got my Army commission as a second lieutenant from there, and then had this 7-year career that took me to various conflict zones and combat zones. So that started in 2003 when I went to Bosnia. Interestingly enough, after 9/11, I didn't have a chance to go to Iraq or Afghanistan. Went to Bosnia, came home, got out of the Army, did explosive ordnance disposal work in Angola in the former Soviet state of Georgia, a little breakaway place called Abkhazia, and then spent 06, 07 in Iraq. And I came home and I had a lot of significant adjustment issues. Like, one of the reasons I left the military, and I think a lot of people leave, is on the micro and day-to-day level, we love our jobs, we love what we do, we love the people we're working with. At the meta level, you kind of begin to question, what is it that I'm doing here? And, the year that I spent in Iraq, we started there as the, weapons of mass destruction. And then it was global war on terrorism. And then the last few months we were rebuilding democracy. So we had these massive mission changes that kept going and kept shifting. And every new leader that came in wanted to do something to make an impact, right? And so anything that we were doing before under an old leader kind of always got shifted to the wayside, and we weren't able to think long-term. It sounds like anywhere else we know, that inability to think kind of long-term in the military beyond a 6-month time frame was a challenge. And I think even now we think about things, some of these huge issues we're trying to figure out around trauma and outdoor recreation and how do those things look at, and we've got to go beyond the 2 to 4 year cycle. And I think this is the third time that legislation has passed at the end of a legislative cycle where people are like, yep, veterans, we should definitely think about how veterans and health can get outside. And we're going to have to bring that up in the next Congress, right? Because maybe it happens post-election. So there is some hope for that. But I came home and I really struggled and ended up with some significant suicidal ideation and addiction and alcohol challenges. And over time, to make a long story short, what I realized that the gift my impact trauma or post-traumatic stress, which I would never wish on anybody from the military, gave to me was ultimately a broader understanding that I had a significant amount of trauma prior to joining the military. And so the PTSD or adjustment diagnosis disorder diagnoses that I got coming home, ultimately through mental health services, I was able to access outside of the VA system. And this isn't to blame the VA system. The VA system is set up to take care of those traumas that happen during the military. And unfortunately, that misses a large swath of why we're traumatized and why we act the way we do from our generational trauma and our engagement. And so that was really helpful for me to better understand and then work through a lot of the trauma that I had leading up to the military, which then allowed me to which pieces of trauma to integrate, which pieces of trauma to leave behind. And the outdoors played a really, really significant role in that. And the reason that was for me was a friend who took me out rock climbing. And I think what the outdoors did for me and what it does for most people is it allows those moments almost unexpected, especially early on in our time venturing outside, where you're just pulled out of your own head, right? And you're pulled into a moment and your ego dissolves and you're focused on the here and now. And those are all things, the ego dissolution, being pulled into the moment, those are all labels and frameworks we apply after the experience. I think the bigger challenge now moving forward, I think there's two challenges on either end of the spectrum. I think one is, how do we get people into the outdoors who maybe have never had the chance to get in the outdoors, or who may be intimidated by outdoor media that myself and others have been a part of creating, right? Like, if you're not going to go climb Denali, what's the point of getting into the outdoors? So I think that's the challenge. I think in Alaska, you face a really unique challenge that we see a lot here in Utah. I'm based out of Salt Lake and Moab. And one of the reasons Bears Ears was so controversial down south, which is the outdoor economy built for the local community or to bring tourists and other people from the outside? And I think oftentimes a recreation economy and a tourism economy are built for other people, right? So if you live there, just shut up and serve us coffee and fill our gas or whatever, or what have you. And I think figuring out how we do outdoor recreation that really engages the local community, as well as providing support for others, but really taking that community first approach is really critical. And then I think the second piece that we really have to look at is what happens when lifelong outdoor enthusiasts, activists, professional athletes, when the outdoors actually becomes the source of trauma. Can we use the outdoors to peel that back? And I think meshed in with all of that, right, especially in a place like Alaska and the United States generally, is what does that mean when we are discovering the power of the outdoors over the last 10 years, when different communities have always felt that, have always known about that, maybe because of the reservation system and the way that we've treated our native communities, are no longer able to access places that were once sacred and supporting to them, or when even going outside is going to be traumatic to somebody else because of the experiences that they'll face. Because yes, the outdoors does not care about your race, gender, or other identities, but a lot of people out there do, even if they think they're doing the right thing. And so I think those are kind of those are the opposite end of the spectrum, but there's a lot smashed in there that we really got to figure out around health and wellness in the outdoors. And, I'm a 6'7" white guy with a beard. I'm not wearing plaid today, but I am wearing my Patagonia vest. So I think also figuring out how we change representation in the outdoors is critical, because, I like to think that I'm a pretty open, warm guy, but my mother-in-law tells me I have resting Ragnar face, which, he's like the questing Viking destroying the UK or whatever in that history show, The Vikings. And I can only imagine what it's like for somebody who's not a normative outdoor user if I'm huffing and puffing down the trail and they're like, oh, holy fuck, here comes Ragnarok, like walking down the trail.
All right, there was a lot there, Stacey. Thank you.
You told me to go there.
I did, and you went there, which is great. So there's some things I know we're going to talk in circles. So there are things I want to come back to in a little bit, but there was this, so making an impact. I think things that rose to the surface for me was, making an impact, the short-term nature of our thinking, which I see in prevention all the time, right? Prevention is the long game. If we're not talking about 20 years, then we're not really talking about creating impact, because, even thinking about in my world, grant funding is 5 years is a long time in the grant funded world. And so those are sort of the cycles that we think in, but just to say, like, I really keyed into that sort of this. And then the other thing I was really keying into was our own mindset around competitiveness. So whether that's like, you know, can I outdoors the best, or if it's, you know, like that just really seemed to be almost the source of my own trauma. That sense of like one-upmanship and what that is, and how do we really like break that down. Like that seems to be a root of some people's trauma, or like really kind of where my mind was going as you were talking about that was you had talked about, you know, your experience in Iraq and coming home really made you aware of trauma that you had been carrying even prior to service, but hadn't been aware of. And I feel like I see that too of like, well, is my trauma as great as this other person's trauma? And if it's not, then can I claim it? And what is my healing process? And am I even aware of it? Like that was, I guess, that was also my process. I wasn't, there was no trauma until there was. And so, I mean, I guess, like, what is that? I mean, how has your understanding of your own trauma shifted throughout the years? Like, how do you help other people like see their invisible wounds? Because I think it's like, well, I'm not living that life, so I got it pretty good. And so we don't acknowledge our own hurt. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think the other thing that happens too is people who are involved in trying to create solutions for other folks and giving back to their community oftentimes forget to do the work or don't engage with themselves, right? So we have people who are the healers, and I think you can see this now during the pandemic where there's this massive burnout. And in terms of reaching out to friends and colleagues in the medical professions right now and trying to offer support and solutions, there's just no time right now for them to do that work, right? Like we never have the time to do the preventative work. We always are responding and responding and responding, because if we stop responding, other people are going to fall off the cliff, right? So we're always basically just running around trying to catch the lemmings as they head off the cliff, because that's what they know to do, right? We're just following. And it's very difficult to say, well, if we stopped and let yes, we're going to lose a certain amount of folks, but we'll be able to create a better system in the long run. Like we're never necessarily able to do that, because we have to create this really horrific calculus that in the short run could hurt a lot of people. And I think, you know, as a veteran, there's not a lot of people who are still, being a veteran is a really interesting thing, because we're both privileged and disprivileged, right? And one of those privileges that also can be really harmful is people put you up on a pedestal, right? And then it's difficult to get down off that pedestal. And if you spend enough time on that pedestal, you begin to question why you should be, you know, cleaning your own toilet or whatever, or paying full price for things. And but you also have a pedestal, and you also have a place oftentimes to speak from. And if I think I've learned anything about trauma and anything about my experience in the military community and the challenges we face, is that if anything, it's a concentration of what the rest of the community is facing, right? The broader world, because we come from America, we are America's veterans, especially, you know, I think maybe a little bit less so than the drafts, because the draft, we were taking people from America who didn't have a choice, and now people are choosing to serve on behalf of their communities. But the reality is, not unchanged, we are yours. And I think a lot of times Americans are taught to assume innocence of their involvement or engagement, and how that might impact other groups, whether that be veterans, you know, the LGBTQ community, women, you know, what have you. We are innocent, and we oftentimes almost violently proclaim our innocence in our hopes of absolving ourselves of any responsibility towards whatever challenge might be happening right now. And that's true, right? I mean, a lot of times we're not the cause, we're not to blame for the challenges individually that our country sees, but we are responsible for now dealing with them, in the same way that, like, if somebody dropped off a baby at your doorstep, you are not to blame for why that baby is on your doorstep, but you are damn well responsible now for figuring out how to get that baby healthy. Right. And I think right now, a lot of us have just kind of stopped opening the door, right? We're just not going to look through the door. We're going to isolate. We're going to find other ways to connect. And so that's, I think, where we're really falling short is And then the pandemic exacerbates all those issues. But I think as a veteran, what I've learned is without a doubt that I don't own trauma, that lots of people have trauma, that there's no point in measuring trauma, right? There's no point in saying like, and I found this early on in my experience with some 12-step meetings was I felt oftentimes like I had just stepped into some weird, and this isn't, some people have great experiences as 12-step. I don't want to take that away from anybody. But my early experiences, I remember I had an individual say like, have you really hit rock bottom? And like the rest of the meeting was an explanation of like one-upping one another on like finding rock bottom and then like drilling blasting caps and like until we got to the hot magma, painful human experience. And so that was a real challenge for me. And I think what we do need to recognize is there is real value in addressing trauma as well as addressing success and happiness and joy in demographic groups, right? There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with saying the way that we experience trauma is really different than the way you experience trauma. The way we experience trauma may have included somebody that looked like you in that trauma. And therefore, it's not going to be helpful for you to try and have an impact right now, right? Like when in preparation for this, when Damon and I were chatting and Lee and Jessica, you were there, he was like, look, it's not helpful for me or my uncles who went through residential school in Alaska where 8 out of 10 people were physically or sexually abused to have somebody like Stacy come in and have that conversation with us about trauma, because the people submitting the trauma and committing the trauma looked like Stacy, and Stacy's viewpoint is really different. Now, down the road, as we got to talk, Damon was sharing some information, and I don't want to speak on his behalf, but was sharing some information about some of his uncles who joined the military, right? And so there's some intersectionality where I can begin to connect through that part of my experience and identity with other veterans. But we do have to recognize there is intersectionality, but I think especially as we look to, begin to break down trauma and begin to move through trauma and begin to find out what are the groups and the processes we need, especially in the outdoors, it's okay to have really specific demographic groups. They're not exclusionary. They're in fact very inclusionary of the people who can help each other through those specific elements of trauma. And down the road, it probably took me 5, 7, 10 years to really recognize that non-veterans could help me in better understanding my trauma and moving through it and finding other ways to cope and to heal. And for a long time, I knew that somewhere. Obviously, my partner's not a veteran, and she's been incredibly helpful. But it took a long ways for me to really break down and recognize that lots of people can help me through that trauma. And I think it's one of the things. And we can talk about the limits, like the real benefits and limits and why outdoors can be a healing modality and what's necessary for that later. But that's really, in a roundabout way, I think what I've learned is that we also, as we move forward, we change our relationship to trauma, right? Like I think about my trauma very differently now than I did 13 years ago. And to the point where it's sometimes difficult to speak with a newly returned veteran whose trauma may be so fresh. Or even speaking with a Gold Star family member whose trauma comes really differently than my own, even though it's all related to the military. And what does it look like for us to be able to support each other? And sometimes I think that support is simply giving people space without being visible yourself. And I think that removes the competitive barrier. Because and I've had these great conversations at different times with different people, especially around campfires. And I use cancer fighters and survivors as a great example because I've never fought cancer. And I've heard from people about their battle with cancer. And I'm like, I can't even imagine that. Like, how strong are you? This is incredible. And I'm awed and inspired. And I feel like my trauma isn't necessarily lessened, but maybe I'm like, oh, like if they can deal with that, I can deal with my trauma. And then they respond in the same way to me that I responded to them. And so I think if anything, not to necessarily expand other people's traumas for them, but to hold up their trauma and to validate it and say, thank you for sharing your story and for thinking that I am worthy of your story. And let me honor that in some way.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for your story. I appreciate it. I do want to just recognize this sort of duality of, this individually felt and experienced trauma and collectively felt and experienced trauma Um, I oftentimes, like there's such stigma around addiction, treatment, and recovery. It comes up literally in almost every social norming conversation we have. It's like, if we had a magic wand, what would we want to change? We'd want to eliminate stigma so that nobody feels that shame or that burden of I can't ask for help when I need help, because I don't want to be labeled as, an addict or an alcoholic, or a person living with alcohol or substance use disorder. And I think what happens in those moments when we distill trauma down just to the individuals, we don't recognize the systems that are coming into play. So you had kind of, you have mentioned, how trauma on a collective scale is felt differently by different groups of people. We know that, like racism, for example, would be, for me, a collective trauma that's felt very differently based on one's lived experience. So I just really appreciate you bringing that in, because it's so true. And I think that, again, like my own experience with my trauma, you kind of move through that, and I think there is a place where there's kind of this recognition of, trauma is trauma is trauma. And so I think, there's distinction, there's difference, and there's sameness at the same time, is my experience.
Yeah. And I think trauma is trauma is trauma in the same way that dinner is dinner is dinner, right? In that there are basic elements that are always going to look the same for dinner, but those are going to look different across cultures. And there's going to be good dinners and bad dinners, right? In the same way that I think when we think of addiction and recovery, I mean, just broadly, we think we want things to be too linear, right? Like, okay, I dropped down and now I'm going to come back up and here it is. And I was having this conversation this last week because, the pandemic too, right? Like, let's acknowledge the pandemic sucks, and a lot of people are traumatized and trying to do things by it. And it may not end up being generational trauma, but there's a lot of pain here. And I keep coming up to this challenge of kind of breaking through to the next level of my own professional careers. So right now I drive a forklift, right? Because everything I was doing, I was speaking for a living, I was leading outdoor trips and thinking about mental health and getting ready to launch a company. And we're now in the process of, we've relaunched a company, and we're excited to work with Recover Alaska on some of that. If other people here are interested, ask Jessica. I think there might be some spots available for a Zoom adventure at home program we're doing. And that is, it just changes. And we don't need to look at things so linearly on trauma. Like, you're going to have good days and bad days. And over time, the good days are going to outwit the bad days, I think. But then there's going to be things like the pandemic that shift around. And I remember this moment a couple of years ago. We were working on we were cleaning out the shelves in our kitchen, and we had a bunch of homemade and canned tomato sauce, and the shelf broke, and and it sounded like a shot the way it broke, and a bunch of glass fell and exploded, and there was tomato sauce exploding everywhere. There was shattered glass. Like, it was this huge shelf full of stuff that we had overfilled from the abundance of our garden. And I just was like, I handled it. I was like, hey, there's glass everywhere. I told at the time our 3-year-old or 2-year-old, I said, hey, don't walk over here. There's a bunch of broken glass. I said, Mackenzie, why don't you just grab Wilder, go to your mom's. This is going to take a while to clean up. I'll do it. I'll give you a call when you're back, so nobody gets their feet cut. And she just looked at me horrified, like absolutely horrified. And I was like, is everything okay? And she was like, I just assumed you were going to lose your shit. Like, massive mess, screws up the day entirely, very loud, tomato sauce looks like blood. And she's like, and you didn't do anything. And it was one of those moments of like, oh, am I healed? Like, this is amazing. What a great day. But then, I heard a loud noise the other day and jumped out of bed and thought that I was going to get attacked. And so, like, we go through these cycles. And I think that's the biggest thing around addiction and recovery. And I think a lot of times, when I talk to people, or, people call me and they say things like, hey, like, you're like kind of a cool sober guy. So I want to put you in touch with my friend who's going through XYZ. Like, what would you tell him? And it's like, what would I tell your friend, because people don't want to admit that they're hurt, and people don't want to admit that they're frustrated, and people don't want to admit that these same systems, which we can see sometimes and recognize are so clearly hurting other people, are also hurting ourselves. And we don't want to say that we're part of those systems because we also maybe get some benefit from it. And we don't want to say that we're in recovery because it means that if we have a relapse, that we've now created something else to be shamed about. And I think that's kind of like, how do we break all that stigma down of being like, look, you're normal, you're just, and even like kind of celebrating the aspects of addiction and alcoholism. We don't think about celebrating that, but, and for good reason, but over the last couple of years, and you've met Kurash over email, who's my partner in a lot of this, but Kurash and I talk a lot about, and Kurash introduced this subject to me. He's like, look, if you wake up every day and you recognize you have this huge pain point and something that really hurts, and maybe you don't understand why it hurts or why you feel that way, and you find a way to get through the day, let's celebrate that. Let's celebrate the fact that you're trying to address a pain point and a problem and a challenge. You may be addressing it the entirely wrong way. It may lead to more pain. It's going to have some real circumstances, but let's celebrate the fact that you're trying and you are strong to find that solution. You just may not have the context, the resources, the support necessary to get the help to deal with that pain, and then ultimately find the root and cause of that and find a way to integrate that, remove it, move on. And I think that's the biggest thing around addiction and recovery and pain, that we oftentimes don't allow ourselves the celebration of the effort of success. And you're making it through every day, and that is fucking awesome. Now let's figure out how to get you every day in a way that's not maybe adding and causing or creating so much additional pain.
Right. And that feels like the premise of harms reduction for me. So thank you. I do want to move on from pain processes and just, for me, talking about trauma, I start to dissociate sometimes, and my shoulders get tense. So if other folks are feeling that, this is an invitation to breathe, because it can be really real. And it's very unfortunate when we talk about trauma and don't acknowledge the fact that every person in this room has experienced trauma to some degree. And so recognizing that, breathing through it, that's a practice for me anyway. Okay, so you've used, so we're going to kind of pivot. You've used outdoors as a significant means to address your trauma or advocate for others to engage in or deal with theirs. Why is that? What is the benefit you've had from your time outdoors? And do you think it's transferable to all people?
I do, without a doubt. I think the Leah Brassi quote, she's a surfer. She has this beautiful quote, which is at the end of all my emails. It's maybe like being really in love, but it's love from nature and from the hand that made you, that can really fulfill you for a while. And I think that cures a lot of things. And I think when we spend time, and I've had the opportunity to do a lot of research and partner with a lot of great researchers around the benefit of the outdoors, with Dacher Keltner, who's been my primary research partner from the Greater Good Science Center at Cal Berkeley. He's a neuropsychologist, and we have looked really specifically at this emotion of awe and what the emotion of awe does. And I should find a definition here that we can use and I'll pop that in the chat box if people are wondering. But I think there are, and what we've learned is that time outdoors and awe have these really amazing physiological and psychological components to what they do when we feel that, right? And that is everything from reducing the inflammation effect. There's a lot of positive hormonal changes. The body relaxes, we breathe deeper, our heart rate oftentimes goes down. We also find ourselves in these situations sleeping better, that was one of the things that we were really surprised. We saw an increase of 1 to 2 hours of sleep after people started spending time outside. But the thing that I am most excited about when we look at the power of the outdoors and time outdoors with awe is that people are more cooperative. So we call these pro-social emotions. They have more pro-social emotions. They're more cooperative. They're more curious. They're more open to new information, and they feel a deeper sense of connection to themselves, to the people around them. And that actually has some follow-on experiences when they get home. They're more connected to their families and to their communities. And that's just through time outside. And that is what I'm really interested in the most part, is that sense of curiosity and cooperation and openness to new information, because I think that is where, yes, we need to reduce the inflammation effects. Yes, we need more positive hormones in the body. There's cytokine responses. Yes, we need to get people sleeping better, especially because there's a lot of collaborating research that shows that post-traumatic stress disorder, might really be post-traumatic sleeping disorder. And I think, disorder is always challenging, but it's true. It's like your stress regulation is disordered because of trauma. Let's find a way through that. Adjustment disorder, which I think a lot of people who are leaving institutional environments or specific environments and then putting into a new environment, we see a lot of that, right? When people move out of a small community into a big city, or from a big city into a small community, there's a lot of disordered adjustment that happens. That's not a bad thing. Having a disordered adjustment, having a disorder is not a bad thing. It's just describing what is there. And I think that is that level of curiosity and openness creates opportunities for us to create significant change. I think where we get stuck oftentimes when we think of time outdoors and what it is we say things like, well, the outdoors are free for everybody. Like, really? Do they have a warm enough coat? Do they have the right boots? Do they know what to do? Have they experienced other trauma in the outdoors previously? When I was at the Sierra Club, we worked with the Philadelphia Veterans Center, which is a non-government sponsored veteran support center. And we actually did a lot of hiking with homeless veterans. And people were surprised that people who didn't have steady homes were interested in hiking and experiencing the outdoors, but it was in a safe environment and it gave them a chance to experience the outdoors in a very different manner, right? Like, once we had some housing situations, they didn't have to look at the outdoors as, where's my best spot to be hidden from the police? Where's my best spot to stay warm? And I think that's when we think about, is the outdoors something for everybody? The answer is yes. We've just got to find how to access what that is. So if you're a big mountain skier and you've skied all the peaks in Alaska or in the Chugach Range, I don't think anybody's ever done that, but it'd be awesome if somebody did. But that's also a situation where maybe you got into it because you were seeking that awe, you're seeking the joy, you were seeking maybe some bigger adrenaline. And that becomes the thing that is now, you look back at your career and you think about all the times you're trembling getting it. And I'm speaking from a close friend who shared some of this stuff with me, shaking as he's getting out of the helicopter, dreading the fact that he has to get in the helicopter, dreading that he's got to try and make a great segment for a film. And that drove a lot of his own trauma. So is there something in the outdoors for him? Certainly, but it looks a lot different now. It looks like sitting on the beach. It looks like contemplating daisies and sketching flowers. It looks like quiet music as he stares at the stars far away from snow in the Joshua Tree Desert, right? So I think those are the things that we have to look at is find what those are. And when we think about prescribing the outdoors, for the most part, what we've done in the past is the doctor just hands you like a prescription and you go to the park. Well, if nobody's ever taken you to a park before, or if you've experienced trauma in a park, what does that look like? So how do we help people through and into that? And I think that's where we want nature to be this cheap and easy solution. And I think long-term, it is a cheaper and easier solution, but it needs support, right? I mean, we need to ask people, and this is what Kurash and I are doing. We need to ask people, what's your intention for wanting to go outside? What's your spiritual and emotional intention? What's your physical intention? And then figuring out how to integrate those experiences. And my guess is a lot of the people on this call have had somebody, whether it's a mentor or accidentally, who's helped integrate those experiences in their everyday lives. Like, well, what do you want to do? Where do you want to go? What did you learn? But most people don't have that. And if you look at, Jessica, you and I's generation, the level of mentorship in the outdoors has dropped off significantly from where it was from some of the men and women, Kit Deloria and Conrad Anker, who had some of those. And I don't want to speak, I know I shouldn't speak for Kit. I know Conrad had very strong mentorship throughout the process.
Yeah, I'm hearing a couple things. I'm hearing that there's a need to expand our shared meaning of what accessing the outdoors looks like. And I'm also hearing, kind of to loop back again to this sort of provider connection. So if somebody's giving a prescription to go to a park, like what is their connection to the outdoors? And how are they sort of presupposing like this is how you get outdoors based off their own awareness? I also just want to recognize that Damon is with us. Awesome. Welcome, Damon. So
yeah, and I want to point out too that there is not actually a height or hair requirement of 6'7" and larger with no hair to be this panelist. It just happens that Damon and I are both.
Sorry, I messed up my time frame. Sorry about that.
Well, welcome. We've covered a lot, but did you just want to introduce yourself so folks know who you are?
Sungai La, Outland Long is Hashbi Good Night Lagan, Stigidi Chinu Ejin, Elchinasi Nanu Ejung, Tau Kunstiao Ejung, Saudai Get Ishanao Ejung, Nung Hashang Stung, Sinudika Ong, Tsashlanas Iskian, Kaj Adi, Gusuri Qualgan, Hadas Iskian, Shingrao Ejung, Hikta Handalai, Iskian Kik Kwang Awanash Ejung, How Aganash Chish. My name is Dan Holter, and I'm incredibly late, and I'm sorry for not showing up in time, but I hope I could, join in and make this conversation worthwhile. I grew up in Heidelberg, Hicktahandlai, like I said in my introduction. My Haida name is Nung Hashlang Stungs, which means big enough to hold two souls, and I was given that name by my uncle Chuck Anatkong, who is a Green Beret and a cultural bearer for our community. And I was also given a lot of my cultural knowledge from my mother, Tau Kuntz, Sherilyn Bell. And that's where I get all of my cultural knowledge and a lot of my upbringing. So I was very fortunate to grow up in Heidelberg, Alaska, Hicktahandlai, learning my ancestral ways. And then I was even more fortunate that I had an opportunity to get out and travel the world. So I have a mix of both backgrounds of getting out and seeing the world, and then, growing up in my village and my community and understanding those values. So thank you guys for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. We had moved through this conversation around invisible wounds and trauma and have kind of transitioned now into a conversation about healing and the role of the outdoors in that process. And I'd really love to hear from you, Damon, like what that has been for you. What is the power of the human-land connection in our healing process?
Mm-hmm. I think, like I said before when we had the conversation, was being able to really connect to the land and understand why we connect to the land. That's been a big part of my healing. And I left and I didn't realize that until the last couple of years. When I left home, I was 14, and I went off and I started pursuing my dream, and it captured a majority of my attention through basketball. And when I did that, I was always getting comments about how lucky I was to be traveling the world and experiencing all of these things. And I was lucky, but at the same time, I was giving up home. I didn't get to come home as much as I wanted. And then the last couple of years, it's been a good thing because I've been able to experience home in my lands and be outside more. But at the same time, I've been able to be triggered a ton too, because I got introduced back to the places where a lot of my traumatic experiences happened. So basketball was a good thing because it suppressed so much of my trauma, but I was able to use basketball to get through the trauma. But ultimately, like I said, it just suppressed everything. So the last couple of years, I've been having more opportunities to connect with my land and where I came from. And it's been really, really powerful. So like this last year, and since COVID happened, I did a lot more camping trips, and I've been home a lot more. I've been fishing and hunting, doing the things that I grew up doing. So I've been having a tremendous amount of healing simply by doing the things that I grew up doing. And I didn't have an opportunity to do that. So my bike trip and all the time I spent out biking around, all these different lands and being out in the woods, those are things I grew up doing. Those are what I was passionate about. And I'm seeing that when I look at pictures of me as a kid, it's me putting together bikes or me working on bikes. And it's like a big a big circle for me of me coming back to the things that brought me joy as a child. And as men and as people, we don't get to exercise what brings us joy as children, you know? And I think that's what I get opportunity to do now is I'm connecting with the things that brought me joy as a child, working on bikes, camping, fishing, hunting, all the things that everyone saw Dan Bell Holter doing as a kid, as a village boy in Heidelberg, Alaska. I get to go back to all those things now. And I think that's my biggest healing is I get to go back to those things and experience those things without the trauma, you know, because I'm being brought up in all of those experiences and I get so many powerful things. Again, I learn all these really, really important things, but I'm also being brought up in a tremendous deal of trauma. Now I get to go experience land. I get to go experience the water and all these things. And now I get to bring my 7-year-old son to these places. He gets to walk on the beaches that I got to walk, but he gets to do it in such a good way where I'm teaching him about the water. I'm teaching him about our stories. I'm teaching him about the waters he's touching and the beaches he's on and how our ancestral people came to find those ways. So it's like one big circle is that the childhood Damon didn't get to experience all these things I'm experiencing now. And I get to give those things to my 7-year-old son in the form of love and teaching and understanding. So the outdoors is incredibly healing. And I see how my 7-year-old son loves outdoors. So there's a big chunk of me in him and I'm seeing that. So I think that's where I'm healing right now with the outdoors is I get to introduce my son to the outdoors and where I come from and the things that I got to do and the things that I loved. And you know, he finds it hard to believe, you know, because, you know, I've been successful in basketball and he laughs around with me about when I do tell him stories or when the uncles come up to him and tell him about how good of a fisherman his dad was or how much his dad was in the river every day or you couldn't get Damon out of the river. And these people tell my son these stories and he laughs around because he doesn't believe it sometimes because you know, he's just been able to see me in a different light and he's been able to watch me on my basketball journey. And like I said, like that's the biggest form of healing for the outdoors for me right now is being able to connect my son and connect myself to the things that I loved doing as a child.
It's beautiful. I really appreciate you calling child self into this space. Just last night, I was lamenting the fact that as I get older and, you know, grow into my adulthood more and more, I find my mind racing as opposed to wandering. And I miss the sort of childhood, like just laying around, like letting my mind wander and really wanting to reintegrate that practice. I also, you know, have come across, I was talking with someone in Bristol Bay region last week, and we were talking about how the land knows the spirit of the people, which I'm hearing you talk about of like, it's probably a very different experience for you as a Haida man on the land of your ancestors doing this healing than it is for people whose ancestors have not known this land for 10,000 years. And when we had our previous conversation, you did talk about, you know, very specific healing spaces for Black and Indigenous men. Could you talk a little bit more about your experience creating those healing spaces?
Yeah, it was something where I always think about as a kid and something that frustrated, again, my mother, and her Haida name is Tau Kunz, which means the strongest bed in the copper. Which means she holds people together and she brings people together. And as a kid, I would get frustrated with her because the fishing game feared my mother. You know, like they didn't want her around because she would flex our tribal sovereignty so hard and she would tell them to get the heck out of our community when it comes to trying to police us. So I got to experience that. I had a very, very strong instinct for tribal sovereignty and knowing who we are and knowing that that's our land. And as time went on, I realized how proud I was. And once I started to travel Indian country as a freshman in college, because I started to become good at, you know, have a successful basketball career, people started asking me to come do basketball camps in their communities. But I started like going to the communities and I hear these stories of like these very prominent Indigenous men. And then the same thing when I'm 15 years old, I started playing. The very first team I played for was a team from Compton, the second AU team. So I went I'm in Compton for the whole entire summer, basically. So I saw how there was similar oppression and I saw how there was lateral violence. And I saw so many of similar systematic problems, but it didn't click for me till the last couple of years, probably 4 years ago, where it really clicked for me on the why. And the thing that really hit me was I was doing all this work for 8 years within our indigenous communities. I've been heavily ingrained in the Black community through my basketball career, and I kept seeing all these recurring things. But again, these narratives, but it didn't click for me until 4 years ago, when the Me Too thing started happening. People started, oh, men are trash, and all these conversations, and I'm sitting there like, okay, like, what's my part in this? Everyone's looking to me. I have a platform. Everyone's wondering like, what's my stance going to be on these things? And I started thinking to myself, I was like, okay, me running around going women power, that's performative allyship, And what I said to myself was, okay, what is my stake in this? How can I support my community? And I started thinking of like all of the men I grew up with. Literally a majority of the men I grew up with are dead or in jail. I go to villages, same exact thing. Alaska Native men, we represent 6% of Alaska's total population. We represent 38% of the prison population in Alaska. 1 out of 3 Black men is going to be jailed in their lifetime or go to prison. There's so much systemic racism and so many things that have gone on that we're literally like, all of my great uncles attended residential school. 7 out of 10 boys who attended residential school was molested or raped. So that's still carrying on. Those are the things that I carry, and those are the things that I fortunately get to break when it comes to my son. But so many men I grew up around don't have access to what I've had access to: health and wellness. I've had access to mentors. I've had access to therapists. I've had access to all these things. So what I realized was that I have privilege. I realized this years ago, and it was a lot for me to like take in. Oh, I'm a brown person. I have privilege. No, I don't. But once I realized, like, oh, I had to sacrifice my whole entire lifetime for the most part to gain privilege. The only reason I'm here right now, and the only reason people are listening to me right now, is because I was successful in basketball. If I'm just another kid from Heidelberg, Alaska, who drinks or does whatever the case may be, then no one cares, And that's what I realized. Like, there's so many men in my community, and I'm from Heidelberg. So many men who could have been prominent artists, who could have been prominent athletes, and I have survivor's remorse because so many guys I grew up with were so dang talented and smarter than me and had all these skills, who were charismatic, who had all the power of influence, but no one will ever know it. So 3 years ago, I started to say, okay, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to see a therapist because, one, I need to work on myself. And if I'm going to be talking about these things, I started seeing a therapist. I made it through 1 therapist, 2 therapists. And I said, okay, these people don't understand my trauma. None of these people understand my trauma. You know what I do? I know more about my trauma. I've done enough trauma work to know more about my trauma than you know about my trauma. I just don't know what the heck I need right now. So I said, you know what I'm going to do is, like, I'm just going to create space. And people would say, hey, could you come do a basketball camp? I'd say, well, can I spend time with your boys and your men? I guess, sure. Like, people, because no one's ever talked about it. So there's communities I would go into, and I'd host these spaces, and slowly but surely, like, the first night, 3 or 4 guys would be there. The next night there'd be 8 guys, and then 15 guys. And it was like that every place I went. It was like organically growing because it was just creating a space. And that's what I emphasize to people. It's not about being the perfect man or whatever the case may be. It's about having conversations that lead to what does that even look like? Because in my eyes, and like what we're seeing now, that we've seen the last 10 years with women stepping into Congress, we have 2 Native American women who are in Congress, we have women who are stepping in leadership. That's 40, 50 plus years of work, like hard, heavy work by a lot of the women who really paved the way for a lot of our now activists and whatnot. That's a ton of work, And now what I'm seeing is so many people are expecting men to just go from here to here. But in order for us to change our behavior or change these things, we have to be, okay, here's trauma. Because we talk about alcoholism, drug abuse, domestic violence, whatever the case may be, all the underlying issues is trauma. So my thing was that I'm just going to create spaces for men so we could talk about things. And over the years, it's organically, I've gotten so much testimonies and stories last couple of years of men who have experienced so many terrible things. And there's a database for, 87% of Alaska Native women and Native American women have experienced violence in their life. I can guarantee it's the same for boys and men, for Indigenous and Black boys and men. I can guarantee that the percentages are high, just as high, and the sexual abuse is very, very high, but we'll never talk about it, So that's my thing, was like, I wanted to create a safe space for men to get together and talk, and boys to talk. And like, that was my thing, is that could be my push, and how I could support our communities and our women, is that I could help create space for boys to learn how to cope, to learn how to talk, to learn how to have conversations and communicate, creating space for men to start unloading and letting out that inner boy that needs that love, that needs that support. So that's why I wanted to do it, is that there was nothing out there. And trust me, I did the work. I looked up places, I looked up gatherings, I looked up conferences, I looked up groups. There's very, very few resources or programs that directly focus on the mental health of our men, of these two demographics. So that's why I started raising the conversation, and people are slowly understanding, like, this is something we need to talk about. Otherwise, there's going to be a lot of boys who are going to be left behind, you know?
And not just lack of resources, but lack of resources that actually will contribute to healing, because this, your experience of, I pursued mental health support through therapy, but
yeah,
clinicians just didn't know. They just didn't know. They couldn't help me. Is not, I mean, I part of the work that the Alliance does is coordinating and strengthening this statewide upstream prevention network. And we have really vulnerable conversations with folks from all over the state. And that's a shared experience across our state. I think it's also circling back. I just want to name the work and the time it takes to see impact. I appreciate you seeing a need and filling the need. And I hear that as a call to action for everybody in this space right now. If you see something that needs to be done that's not being done, just do it. We don't need to sit around in meetings and talk about doing it. We just need to do it. So I appreciate that. And I'm also circling back to this concept of it takes time. And so I think that sometimes in our conversation, or when I say our, I mean sort of conversations that I'm having around, like, well, how do we undo white supremacy and racism? Because we know that those are really harmful systems. And the violence experienced by people under those systems, and then perpetuated maybe externally, is less about an individual like deficit and more about a cry for help, or an unmet need. But people, when I say, so we're having these conversations about, like, how do we do that, and people get really, like, white people get really daunted by, like, I don't know what to do, and it's like, well, you have to do something, and no one person is going to be able to like solve it all, but we all have to do something. I also think it kind of goes back to, and you spoke a little bit about privilege, and that kind of in my mind connects to, is accessing outdoors privilege? Is that privilege? Are people in privileged positions to be able to access outdoors? Have we set up an industry that's removing that connection, that land-human connection, or like making money off of that human-land connection in a way that is reducing access and creating a barrier for people?
Yeah, no. Yes, absolutely. And like I said, my idea of camping growing up and for a long time was us bringing out a big tarp, and we're village, we're straight out of Heidelberg, and that was my idea of camping growing up. But like, I've grown, and I've had, like you said, I've had access to privilege, and that's what I've been having this conversation when it comes to the cycling, when it comes to these camping things, is I am extremely fortunate that I have access to these resources to go out and do these things. I have access to go cycling, and I have access and freedom to all of these things. And it's exactly that. You go to these stores and you go to these companies, everyone has money. And that's something, I really addressed with the organization that reached out to me to support some of the work I was doing. And they wanted to give us gear and these different things. I said, okay, well, that's fine. That's great. But also on top of that gear, contribute to this program that I work with that deals with 98% Alaska Native kids who are at risk. Like, it's nice to talk about it. And that has always been my thing, is that it's nice to talk about it, but it's way more important to do it. So being able to acknowledge that these things are expensive, like these tents, sleeping bags, like all of this stuff is very, very expensive. So at the end of the day, it's like, we have to take a step back and acknowledge that. I was at a bike shop and I was sitting there talking with, like, man, because they're telling me, they're like, yeah, we're selling 15, 20 bikes a day. I'm like, these bikes are thousands and thousands of dollars. Like, what the heck? What families have all this money just laying around? And he was like, yeah, I guess, people go on vacations and stuff and just had, spare 10 grand sitting around, $5,000. I'm like, not where I come from. Like the people I work with and the people that I grew up around, we don't have an extra 5-10 grand just casually laying around. We go spend on bikes. Like it doesn't work like that for us. So being able to see all of these things, and again, it's taken me like getting to these places of privilege. I'm around professional skiers now. I'm around professional cyclists. I'm around very, very well-known people. And I'm able to see like how it's so dang privileged, and being able to look back and say, like, where I come from, these people, we don't have access to this stuff. We don't have these opportunities. And you go to these big stores, and how the outdoor organization has been turned into like this like boutique like place, in a sense of the nicest gear, the nicest tents, the nicest sleeping bag. So I think it's a very, very privileged space, the outdoors, and everything from taking work off. A lot of people can't afford to take work off to go camping. A lot of people can't afford to pay the $35. That's one of the hardest things I have with these forest parks and everything, is that you have to pay to go stay there. You have to reserve these places. And I'm sitting there, and because I always look up the history of whose land we're actually on. So no matter where I go, I always do my land acknowledgement, whether I'm speaking or wherever the case may be. Is I always say a nice little prayer to the ancestors when I know I'm going to spend time on someone's territory. But whenever I'm at these national forests and these parks, I'm looking around, I'm like, man, it's probably a lot prettier before people came in here and started messing with everything, So there's so much privilege just to go pay for going to camp for a sleeping bag, it could cost you hundreds and hundreds of dollars. So like, that's what I'm doing right now, is like, I'm trying to find ways to bridge that gap and connect a lot of our big organizations to tribes, to our programs that specifically deal with youth who want to go experience the outdoors. So I think it's a big conversation around privilege and how we bridge that gap. And like I said before, it's us having these conversations and acknowledging that, okay, there's a lot of privilege, and it's very expensive to get into these spaces.
Yeah, I appreciate that conversation. But yeah, and then moving from conversation to action. I'm thinking back on we talked to some young people a couple years ago through Recover Alaska, and we were really just trying to understand like what is there to do. And one of the overwhelming pieces of feedback we got from young people across the state was, well, if you don't want to go outside in smaller communities where there might not be like a teen rec center or whatever, if you don't want to go outside and you don't want to stay home, there's not really a whole lot to do. But what I'm hearing you say is, it's not just as easy as going outside. Stacy talked about mentorship, and I'm also hearing you talk about just the privilege of access. So all of that is all of that feeds into, what do people have to do? So I'm gonna move on. I think so we've been talking about healing practices, using both community level practices that allow people to move through their understanding of shared or experienced trauma together. Why, and Stacy, I invite you back into the conversation. I know you've been giving space to Damon, but I'd love to hear from both of you. Why do you think it's important for people to heal in community with one another? So this could be in the spaces you create, Damon. It could be in the spaces you create, Stacy, either like in a community center or outdoors. Like, why is that important that we're healing together? And how might that be different than individual healing? And when does it make sense to try to do the work of healing by ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, I think listening to Damon, and thanks for all that. I think, and there's a lot to think about in what Damon said. And I think one of the things when we think about health and wellness in the outdoors, before I get to the meat of your question, is we actually can't really rely on the outdoor industry to move us in that direction, because these bikes are incredibly expensive and a few people might be making money, but a lot of these entities are just hanging on. And that's part of the challenge, right? Like, I mean, heli skiing is amazing, but it costs a ton of money. And I don't know that many super wealthy heli skiing operators, right? Like the joke is, how do you earn $1 million skiing? It's like starting 10 million, right? So, but I think that's also part of the, the individual and group healing is kind of the same thing, in the sense that, like, for me, it started out with like one other person, right? And them reaching out and helping to kind of break through some of my challenges in the conversations. And actually them using all the wrong words, right? Like nothing that they like, well, maybe you should put off suicide. Like when I was like, I think I want to kill myself. It's like, we should put that off for a couple of weeks, like, and think about something else and maybe come climb with me, right? Like, I don't think any book would tell you to do that. But I think it starts with that level of honesty and connection. If you know that person authentically cares and loves you. And then I think you can move into the group stuff because it's helpful to know you're not alone. And like even the conversations the short conversations Damon and I have had coming from two really, really different places have also been healing, right? It's just this reminder of not being alone in trauma. It reinforces for me that there's other people who have trauma really different than my own, and they can provide benefit to me, which 13 years ago, I certainly didn't think. And that was a big part of it, was just being surrounded by a similar experience and people who could speak to me directly. And then I think we do have to move in and out of that individual space, because there is a time where you just want to shut off all the other voices and give yourself the space to reflect and process. And I think going back to what Damon said with, the 40 and 50 years of hard work around women's activism, and like we have finally, and out of Kansas, right? Like our first LGBTQ native congressional comes from Kansas, which is awesome for so many reasons. And but I think you can't do the hard work without a support group. And that's where the community comes in, and that community is going to evolve as you grow. And I'm sure Damon had, like you said, you went to Compton and that community looked really different than your home community, but maybe some of the healing started there, and you pop in and you pop out and those communities change. But then, even with awe, what we find, I think, is that it's never necessarily the big rapids or even standing on the mountain or the big ski down the couloir. It's in those moments when you're skiing down the apron and you've made it safe. It's in the moments of the quiet, still waters when everyone's kind of exhausted from the big rapids, where people report having the emotion of awe and feeling this deep connection to others. And I think it's also like this morning, I got up really early and took my dog on a walk, and I was all by myself. And I felt most connected to my family and my friends and my community alone this morning than I sometimes do, when we're all together, strangely enough. So I think it's just being able to move in and out of that, and knowing that you have the support to pull you in and pull you out. And oftentimes too, just to sit with you in the hole, as opposed to try and drag you out of it.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Stacey. Similar to what Stacey was saying, and that's what I've realized too, is that I realized through my work, through my basketball camps, is like I was creating spaces for people to suffer together or go through adversity together. And that's what brings us together, is adversity and hard, difficult things and uncomfortable circumstances brings us together. And this concept of a lot of people think like, oh, you have to just like kind of go disappear off and on your own, or, figure it out and see a therapist. We heal through relation, connection. And I saw that in my work, and I saw that in my camps. I saw this thing like, okay, I'm creating community, I'm creating connection. And like, that's what making my thing so successful. That's why I'm creating. Once I realized that, I started putting language behind that last couple of years of this is what like provides healing, is us having that common community. And that's what helped for me, was being able to step into these spaces of other men and be like, oh, I'm not the only one. Oh, this hasn't just happened to me. And that's creating that common connection. And then and I joke around people, is like, you're able to trauma bond, but as long as you could figure out how to do it in a good way and making sure that it's a good space to trauma bond, like that's exactly what we're doing, is we're trauma bonding. But there's a negative context behind, the negative type of trauma bonding, where you're sitting around and just complaining and not doing anything about it, not figuring out how are we going to move forward. So I think that's the thing is like, you're able to trauma bond, but figuring out a way to do it in a good way where you're coming up with solutions. Because oftentimes we talk about the problem. And again, that's why I'm so active and want to constantly do things, is like, I have a big issue with people sitting around talking about problems all day and day. Like, go do something about it. People say this generation or this, like, how much time are you spending with this generation to have a critique of this generation? You know, how much time are you spending working with communities and the people who have these issues are struggling to actually have this critique? So that's my thing, is that it just creates a level of accountability. It creates a level of support, and you're able to just lean on each other and have each other's back. And that's what it saw through my bike ride, was being able to really look to each other and look to each other for inspiration. It could be really, really powerful if you create that support network who's going to hold you accountable. But once you have that support and create that support, and like Stacey said, you're able to go off and have your alone time and not freak out because you don't have that support. But being able to lean on people and then be able to lean on your own kickstand as well, I think is very powerful. And I think you build those skills up through community by listening to other people. How did you do it? How did you do it? How did you do it? Oh, I've learned all of these things. This might not work. That might not work. This helps a little bit, and that helps a little bit, you know? So I think that's really, really, really cool, is being able to have a bunch of people have common issues or common problems, but be able to say, okay, like, this worked for me, this worked for me. And I think that's where the healing comes in, is you're able to, because there's no secret sauce to healing. You know, there's a lot of different tested theories, and there's so many theories out there. But at the end of the day, it's like, unless we try and have the conversations, and we can't discover what our own healing can be.
And I think, just really quickly, you're in a good community of support and healing when they encourage you to try multiple avenues of healing and support. And when they, I remember going through one treatment protocol and it didn't work, and it wasn't working for me. And I took that as a continued failing, right? Like, I've already fucked up with however many, thousands of dollars spent on drugs and shame and alcohol and all that stuff. And I'm like, oh, now I can't even get healthy, right? It's a failure. And then when somebody else was like, no, dude, like, that's fine. Like, I tried it and it worked great for me, which is why I encourage it for you, because I see a lot of similarities. But my buddy over here tried X, tried this other thing. Why don't you try that? And let me put you in touch with that person and see if that works. And those modalities also change over time. What worked for me 13 years ago doesn't work for me now. And you just kind of have to recognize that evolution, and it goes back to, the same thing. I mean, Damon knows this well. There's two professions in the world where people, I think, are most interested in who you used to be, and they're more interested in who you used to be. They're not interested in who you are. And that's professional athletes and service members, right? Like, Damon, what was it like signing with the Celtics? It's like, yeah, cool. Like, it was cool, but that's not what I would, that's not what I want to lead with now. Like, I want to talk to you about my biking. I want to talk to you about, like, my son or whatever. And then later on, getting a Celtics jersey is probably an interesting story, but no longer what it once was. Just like being a veteran, very time, in trauma too, people want to keep digging into the past, but we do have to create that space where we say, well, who do you want to be? What do you want to be? Because, like, now, like, I'm proud of the fact that I survived what I put myself through. And early on, I needed people to know that I was sober. I needed people to know that I was in recovery. But that's no longer a specific part of my identity that I want to lead with in terms of a revealed identity. And when you're in a community that allows for that as well to move forward and shift and everything else like that, I think that's how you know. And when a community is also willing to push you back a little bit, but gently, and push back on some of the things and say, hey, like, you've been here for a while now. When are you going to begin to serve this community? What do you need to begin to serve this community? Or what's your idea of moving forward to continue to serve those outside this wall? And that's a different timeline for everybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess what I'm really, the thing that's like circling around in my brain is about journey. I think that there's this concept of like an end point, like, we're gonna make it through and there's gonna be this point at the end, at the other side, but that's just not real, right? Because it's kind of like, it just keeps going. Like, you might get to the end of the thing that you wanted to get to the end of, but then it's like a whole new cycle. It's a whole new beginning. As our awareness grows, collectively. Yeah. I don't want to get stuck in trauma bonding. But it's such an interesting concept. It's like how I've built a lot of how I used to build a lot of my relationships when I was younger, was trauma bonding. And now really thinking about, how might that be perpetuating for me anyway? How might that be perpetuating systems of harm? And how have I ingrained my hurt with my current identity, and what is left to heal anyway? All good thoughts. So many good thoughts. Thank you. So I just want to let people that are in the room right now, let you know that we're kind of getting to our last question. So if you have things that you specifically want to ask Stacy or Damon before we say goodbye, that try to be thinking of those right now, but and type them into the chat box. I really wanted to spend these final few minutes kind of moving from conversation to action. So I would love if you could both tell us more about your current efforts or any programs you're working on now or that are on the horizon, and what people can do to support that work now.
Yeah. I mean, I'm having a lot of conversations. So if people didn't know, a couple weeks ago, I finished up around 1,400-mile bike ride. Started in Seattle, made our way down to Tillamook, had to divert and change our route and go out to Wyoming, and made our way from Wyoming down to Albuquerque, which is around 800 or so miles. And the next trip we're planning is going to be either late May or early June, and that will be a 3,000-mile bike ride from Kamloops, British Columbia to New York. And right now we're working on partnerships. We're connecting with a lot of bike organizations and companies who want to support. Right now I'm having conversations around Southeast Alaska and other indigenous communities about partnerships between bike companies, tribes, and corporations to start putting more kids on bikes. For example, the Yurok tribe in Northern California, they're putting 5 kids a week on bikes along with families. And that's through donations, that's through having a lot of conversations. So right now I'm having a ton of conversations about how we can make biking more accessible to our communities and communities in Alaska and other communities who don't have this accessibility like I was talking about. And then I'm about to start planning this 3,000-mile bike ride in June, which will be riding in solidarity with the Secwepemc people up there near Kamloops, as they're fighting for their traditional land right now. They're trying to put an oil pipeline, and they're trying to build a 1,000-man man camp, which leads to violence on their indigenous women. So that ratio is 1,000-man man camp to about 120 indigenous women in this small village. So we're going to ride in solidarity with them. We're going to start from Kamloops, BC, Secwepemc territory, and make our way across Canada and down into the United States. And I think we'll go in through South Dakota and connect with Lakota people and make our way all the way to New York. So what I'm working on right now is things that bring me joy, but things that I know could positively impact the community. And that's where I'm really enjoying myself right now, is that I get to express my creativity. Like Stacy was saying, is that a friend told me recently, unpack all the stories that no longer serve you. And I'm getting unpack my Celtic stuff, is like, I know my basketball career is the reason that people will listen to me, but I'm just going to continue to utilize that as my door opener, because I want to be able to, like Stacey says, really talk about these things that move my heart now and that I'm passionate about now. So right now, like I said, that's all I'm doing is just focusing on the things that make me happy and being able to put time into this bike journey, and then being able to create ways to have more conversation around men's mental health and programming. So that's where I'm at. And you can go look up on social media. It's Break the Bicycle on Instagram, Break the Bicycle. And if you want to look up my Instagram, it's Nung Hosh Long Stung. So you can try and say that 5 times. Good luck.
Yeah. Yeah, my next year, it looks pretty different from Damon's. I started riding this year because like I said earlier, I drive a forklift at a warehouse right now. We are figuring out how to launch more broadly. What started out as Adventure United, but which will be rebranded in the coming weeks, is Outdoor Health Company, to do mental health supported outdoor trips for folks who are interested in lowering stress, lowering anxiety, increasing resilience, and addressing questions they have in their own minds around substance. There'll be a individual outdoor health prescription that's available to folks, so that when they get that park prescription or whatever, they can begin to understand what that looks like and how to move through that. There'll be Zoom programs similar to this in many ways that last for 4 days, either right in a row or one day a week for 4 weeks in a row. I'm honestly hoping to be able to ride bikes with Damon next year. We've talked about some opportunities. It's awesome. I just learned that he might be riding across South Dakota. There's a great ride across South Dakota that happens every year that my uncle's super involved in. And I think it would be great if we could combine some of those things together. Since Damon and I both seemingly our lives have been dominated by our uncles as well. So maybe there's something else we can do there. Uncles who are Green Berets specifically. Mine was also my dentist as a kid. Like, can you imagine going from a Green Beret to a pediatric dentist? It was so frightening. But I've got good chompers now. And then, yeah, just continue to drive forward on that. I think one of the things I know, my guess is everybody's very anxious right now. There's a huge election next week. I think a lot of people are very frightened about the direction it goes one way or the other. And I think what I'm really realizing this week and the last week is that the work I'm doing isn't going to substantially change one way or the other in terms of, I think the antidote to the polarization in this country, I think the antidote to the pain that we've seen that social media, when used improperly, is a negative tool, is really awe and time outdoors. And so I think that speaks to you all in terms of the actions that you're doing. The very fact that you're doing what you're doing, can you do it better? Probably. Can you do it in a more inclusive way? Probably. Can you do it in a way that helps break down systems of privilege and welcomes more people into the outdoors and supports all people in Alaska, specifically tribal communities, specifically those dealing with addiction, specifically those struggling, who do look like me, but haven't had the opportunities or privilege to get out to the resort, and who feel oppressed and pained upon, even if their histories are very different from mine or Damon's or others or Jessica's. So without a doubt, all those things, yes. And we're here as resources to do that, but also just a reminder that you all are doing incredible work, that you are servicing and doing the best to bring people to those moments of awe and to bring people to the outdoors and create that. And if that is all you can do right now, it is more than enough. And I want to thank you for the work you're doing and for the fact that you're showing up to try and figure out how to do it more. And I know I see Mackenzie. I don't know, Damon, if you can see the group chat or not, but Mackenzie Barnwell has a question for you. But I just want to thank you all for being here. I wish I could be there in person. Lee and I have been talking about going to Alaska for a really long time. I know it'll happen eventually. I know I'll get back up there. I work closely with a guy named Ben Sturgielewski, who's a filmmaker, lives down in Girdwell. So yeah, so that's what's next for me. And just want to encourage you to keep doing what you all are doing with kindness and love, and that you are making a difference. And I think in the next 20, 30, 40 years, maybe sooner, because of the continued hard work, we're going to see outdoors and outdoor spaces continue to fill a more important and higher prioritized component of our life, not just for tourism either, but for everybody. So that whether it's Damon Bell, and where are you from, Damon? I didn't hear you say.
Tanglai.
Yeah, from Talangai all the way to, the kid who's coming over from, who found their way to Alaska for the very first time from South Dakota, and is just so excited to be there and so see these big open spaces that they'll be able to meet on a ski slope or on the bike track as equals and supporting each other in their health and well-being. And that's you all doing that work, not me.
What was the question for Mackenzie? I can't see the thing.
I'm happy to read it out for you. So Mackenzie asks, as people who work in the outdoor rec world and are actively involved in expanding outdoor opportunities, how can we do our part to acknowledge and include Indigenous folks and those with trauma backgrounds?
I think the first part, like I said earlier, was doing the work to recognize where you're at. If you want to do outreach to Indigenous communities, if you want to have these conversations, you have to do the work. That's a big part of it. In my field is that I emphasize and encourage people, rather than asking me questions about trauma, rather than asking me questions about Indigenous history, we have a lot of resources and we have a lot of books, we have a lot of documentaries. So I think the first part is do a deep dive in understanding the oppression and the systematic racism and the genocide and colonization, those things that took place on Indigenous lands. Do that work first, and then you're going to have a better understanding of how you're able to connect. Okay, and that's where you'll be able to disarm our Indigenous communities, because our Indigenous communities, we will be skeptical of people trying to come in and help, because we've had a lot of people who have tried to come in and help. So I think that's a big part of it, is doing the personal work. So if you're wherever you're at, whether you're in Anchorage on Dena'ina land, learning about the Dena'ina people, wherever you're at, learn about the land that you're sitting on. There's an app called Native Land that everyone in this whole entire thing should download, and it'll give you understanding. Like I said, where I come from is Tiktahandlai, Haida Tlingit territory. So being able to acknowledge and understand where exactly you're at is the number one start. Once you do all the history, once you start doing your research and learning, then you're going to be able to advocate for Indigenous people, and you're going to be able to have conversations with Indigenous people. Because if we have to spend all of our time explaining to you about our trauma and whatnot, then that's an emotional toll, and that's literally asking us to relive our trauma. So I think that's a big part of it too, is doing your research, learning about residential school, learning about colonization, learning about assimilation, learning about when Alaska lost our state, when we so-called Alaska, when we lost our land in the 1700s, 1600s, when those things started happening, and really doing a deep dive into our history. And another program I would ask everyone to look into is at ANTHC, is the Alaska Blanket Exercise. I'm not sure if people are familiar with it, but it gives us a timeline and a walkthrough about colonization and everything that's happened to Alaska. So again, it's the Alaska Blanket Exercise. And there's a lot of resources out there. So that's what I would encourage anybody who's interested in supporting Indigenous and Black communities. Do your work first before you try and have conversations or try and dive into supporting or helping, because if you're not learning about us or knowing about us, then it's not going to be helpful.
Thank you, Damon. That was, that's really good information. Thank you.
So I think I want to just touch on some of the opportunities coming up through the work with the Alliance that I helped to coordinate. We have an upcoming cohort opportunity with Stacy and Kurash to adventure at home. And so we'll be hosting that December 14th through the 17th. I'll put my information in the chat box. You can reach out if you want more info about that. It's an 1.5 hour cohort experience every day, and then a request that you adventure on your own. You don't have to be on your own, like alone, but you won't be with the cohort while you're doing your adventuring every day. And really excited to see how people conceptualize of that. We've specifically tried to gear it toward people in helping profession, specifically people working with veterans or veterans themselves, people working with reentrants or reentrants themselves. But there might be space for folks who are part of this conversation to also participate in that conversation. The Alliance also is deeply committed to dismantling white supremacy and addressing racism and other power imbalances. And so to that end, we've got some other opportunities coming up, one in February with a facilitator within the Alliance and a group out of Colorado, really working with people to, again, build cohorts and shared learning space to go on this journey of learning around equity and justice. We're also in conversation with First Alaskans to deliver Alaska Native dialogue on racial equity. So more information coming up on that. And then really just trying to gather other opportunities that are coming up. There's just so many in Alaska, outside of Alaska. So that's what we've got going on. I want to say, maybe I'll say my thank you to both of you for being here, Lee for creating this space and for inviting me into it to moderate. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jess. This was is every bit as powerful of a session as I thought it was going to be. And I owe a lot of thanks to Stacy and Damon for their candid sharing of their life experiences and how we might all work together to solve some of these issues. And we too, at Alaska Outdoor Alliance are working to to bring more diversity into our conversations as you see today. And as a reminder, you know, to those listening, the stats show that this is a very homogenous industry, and we can all do our part to welcome others and make others feel welcome into the outdoor space, and that you don't have to have the latest, craziest gear necessarily to have some really amazing outdoor experiences. I'm so sorry that we're not in person because, and we have to settle for Zoom, because I just want to give everybody a big hug of thanks and a fervent wish with Recover Alaska's help that we'll continue to spread the message and reach the Alaskans who most need to hear it. So thanks again to all three of you. Thanks to everyone who tuned in, because you're part of this solution and taking these steps forward. And to everyone on the call, I do hope you'll rejoin us at 1:30 when we'll be talking about how to make our streets more bike and walk friendly, and bringing an active transportation plan off the shelf and into the streets. So at 1:30, we have Sitka Cycling Club and Bike Walk Alaska Summit leader Doug Osborne, who will be helping us chart that path forward with guests from the League of American Cyclists, Bike Anchorage, and the Alaska Departments of Transportation and Health. So we'll be signing off now and hopefully see everyone back at 1:30. Thank you so much.
Thank you.